Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're stepping into a world that is equal parts terrifying and, honestly, profoundly liberating. We're going to explore a really fascinating grimdark Gothic fable called Parables of the Dark Mercy. Now, this text fundamentally reimagines classic Greek tragedies, but it does it through this razor-sharp lens of Nietzschean philosophy and philology that just massively expands on the original stories. We're looking at a universe where the old gods are dead, the heavens are totally indifferent, and total annihilation, well, it isn't the end of the story. It's actually the grueling prerequisite for true existential freedom. So, let's dive into this. I want to hook you immediately with this voice. These are the piercing words of the cold observer, who's basically our harsh, uncompromising guide through this whole text. The observer doesn't care about our feelings at all. In fact, this diatribe sets a deliberately grim tone that challenges every comforting illusion we hold about fate, meaning, and our own self-importance. The observer is literally calling us out, telling us that we just dress our misery up in the finery of tragedy to avoid facing the reality of our decaying world. So, to make sense of this profound critique, here is how we're going to break it down today. 1. The sweetness turns to vinegar. 2. Annihilation as a dark mercy. 3. Stripping the golden cages. 4. The violet in the frost. And finally, 5. The paradox of cold hope. Starting right off with section 1, the sweetness turns to vinegar. Before there can be a rebirth, we gotta understand what exactly is dying here. The source text describes a world where the sweetness of civilization and loyalty is fermented, kind of like rotting fruit, into a completely failing moral order. It's a state of terminal decay. And this brilliantly illustrates a concept the cold observer calls existential rot. Existential rot is that putrid state where a society's moral order has completely failed, yet people just keep clinging to imaginary values and ancient masks. Instead of facing reality, humanity distracts itself. We invent these myths of destiny and hubris basically because we're terrified to admit that the universe actually has no script for us. We rot because we refuse to let go of dead ideas. Which brings us to section 2, annihilation as a dark mercy. This brings us to a radical intervention. Enter a cosmic entity known in the text as the Starfinder. The Starfinder brings absolute cosmic indifference, kicking off a terrifying cycle of total destruction. But here's the catch. This annihilation isn't just mindless violence. It's a dark mercy. It follows a very specific, sequential path. We move from that terminal decay we just talked about straight into a cosmic reset. This reset forcefully burns everything away, leaving behind a blank slate. And that blank slate? It's the only environment where true existential rebirth can actually happen. The cold observer points out that this total annihilation is literally the only mechanism capable of stripping away our pathetic excuses. It's a harsh, cold nihilism, for sure, but this destructive mercy clears the stage so that true freedom can be forged. Moving on to section 3, stripping the golden cages. So what happens when that stage turns to a field of black ash? The text draws a really stark contrast here. On one side, we have the toxic illusions of the old world, things like waxen ambition, rigid identities, the titles we use to make ourselves feel important. On the other side, we have the terrifying but fundamentally honest reality of the underworld, just blank slates and black ash. Let's dive into our reimagined Greek parables, starting with Icarus and Penelope, to examine what it actually means to strip away these golden cages we build for ourselves. Take Icarus. We all know the classic myth, right? Well, in this fable, Icarus doesn't fall into a nurturing, tragic sea. Nope. He plummets through a sky that has finally stopped pretending to care about his waxen ambition. Ironically, in this version, it's not the heat of the sun that destroys his golden cage of mortal ingenuity, but the sheer friction of a world turning into a field of black ash. His plummet is actually his salvation. When he lands in the darkness of the underworld, those old titles of hero and son are instantly erased by the great silence. The crucial point here is that Icarus finally realizes his ascent was just an illusion of value. The underworld isn't a prison. It's the honest ground where his charred remains are finally free from the crushing weight of his father's legacy. And we see a similar, incredibly powerful transformation with Penelope. For 20 years, she wove and unwove her shroud, right? A minor, repetitive cycle of duty that perfectly mirrored the terminal decay of a kingdom waiting around for a ghost. Her loyalty was the sweetness that fermented into the vinegar of stagnation. But when the Starfinder's breath turns her palace to soot, her loom and shroud simply vanish. They're gone, consigning the rigid identities of the old regime straight to the underworld. She is no longer a queen. She's no longer a widow. She becomes an absolute author on a blank slate of ash.
Her golden cage of duty is totally burned away, giving her the terrifying freedom to finally begin her own existence.
Okay, Section 4, The Violet in the Frost.
Here, we shift over to the story of Sisyphus to explore the emergence of life and the stark reality of existential freedom amidst all this cosmic frost. Imagine Sisyphus standing at the base of his mountain, but, plot twist, his hands are empty. The boulder he has pushed for eternity has completely crumbled into gray soot during the cosmic reset. In a very dark twist of irony, Sisyphus is essentially out of a job. First, his punishment just dissolves. Second, without his eternal labor, he recognizes that his struggle was a toxic illusion invented solely to fill the silence of a universe that provides absolutely zero built-in meaning. And third, he is now condemned to be free. He has to choose to brave the frost without that golden cage of his punishment. And what does he find in all that frozen soot? A single violet braving the frost. This is amazing because it brilliantly illustrates the core Nietzschean theme of the text. The violet is a flower of sorrow and death, but it absolutely refuses to wait for a god's permission to bloom. It stands in the cold underworld as the ultimate symbol of emerging life after total destruction, choosing to define its own value. The existential struggle is no longer about pushing a rock. It's about having the sheer force of will to bloom in a cold, totally indifferent universe. Which perfectly sets up our final section. Section 5, The Paradox of Cold Hope. This concludes our narrative arc, where we look at Prometheus, who brings back a very different kind of fire to humanity. Prometheus reaches into the heavens but finds only cosmic indifference, just stars that do not speak. He returns to the survivors not with a warm, comforting fire, but with a cold spark. This spark represents radical autonomy. Think about what that actually means. It's the terrifying power to author one's own future and avoid completely free of masters and laws. It provides no warmth, no comfort, no guaranteed happy ending. It merely illuminates the reality of their absolute authorship. To really hammer home the crushing weight of this realization, let's bring back the piercing voice of the cold observer for a second. There is no king coming to save the weaver, no empire to answer the beacon, and no sky that cares about your name. Brutal, isn't it? But actually, it is also profoundly liberating. The Great Silence is the only honest thing these characters have ever known. By wiping away the empires and the gods, basically turning them into parched lilies, humanity is left with the naked truth of existence. And that brings us to the paradox of hope. When Prometheus hands the survivors this cold spark, the light it casts reveals that the world is a literal graveyard of black ash. They weep at the sight of it. But, and this is absolutely crucial, that very same light is the only illumination necessary to see that the masters and the laws are gone forever. The death of the old world, the annihilation brought by the Starfinder, is the dark mercy that finally grants humanity the terrifying power to truly own their choices. They no longer follow a script. They are the authors. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. We spend so much time clinging to our own ancient masks, right? Our own golden cages, waiting for a sky that cares about our name. But what if we embrace the crushing weight of our own choices? What if we accept that meaning belongs to no one but ourselves? So, in a universe of great silence, what meaning will you author on your own blank slate of ash? Take that question with you today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it sparks a completely new way of looking at the freedom you hold in your own hands.